Hi, Carrie. I see Christine's on.
Hey, Council Edwards, it's Candace today.
Oh, hey, Candace, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good. Just make sure I got the camera. Good, okay.
Hi,
And
good morning.
morning. Okay, we're right on time. I see some folks are in the waiting room.
Good morning, Counselor. This is Anita Tavares.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm well, Anita. So I got the list of folks who are participating. So we have a couple more from the admin. And I think we're waiting on, of course, Councilor O'Malley.
And Council Edwards, I did make you a co-host because I know that we have a list of people who Carrie sent over for public testimony. So I did make you a co-host. So whenever you're ready to admit those people into the hearing, you can.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. I am just going to.
Okay, I'm gonna mute myself. Counselor, do you need me to do anything prior to the start?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think I'm just gonna wait for Madam O'Malley.
Okay, sounds good. I'm gonna mute myself.
Hi, Councilor O'Malley.
Hello, Madam Chair. How are you?
Well, thank you. I am just waiting for a couple folks. They asked me, said that they're on their way. And I think we have also, I think, 2 more folks in the administration. Anita, was Sabino also joining us?
Yes, he's actually here with me. I'm having some difficulty with this camera, but he is here in the room with me.
No problem, no problem. I'm just gonna get the introductory, stuff printed and I will we can start in the next, it's 10:02. Can we say by 10:05?
Perfect. Oh, 1 sec, I think, hold on a sec. Sorry about that. I was just next in the queue, Lydia, for the call's just wrapping up. So I think there's one more counselor and then we may get some more of our colleagues on.
Right. Okay.
How are you, Commissioner Tavares?
Doing well, thank you. How are you?
Good, everybody safe and well in your crew?
Yes,
Good.
thankfully.
Good morning, Matt. Can you hear me? Mic check.
Morning, Michael, loud and clear.
Roger that. Am I the only one on?
No.
I see obviously the chair, Kim, Michelle, Andrea, and Liz.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning. Just waiting
Morning,
a couple
Liz.
more moments.
Good morning. See what time. See.
All right, I think we have a sufficient amount of our colleagues here. I see Cheryl Crawford's here as well.
But I'm
Is-
not testifying. Alex Salaskis from my team is testifying. He might be in the waiting room. Alex, P-S-I-L-A-S-K-I-S.
Okay, and also I have a Tegan George.
George. She's
Okay.
on my team, so we were observing, but Alex is actually testifying on our behalf.
Okay, thank you. Okay. All right, folks, we'll just go ahead and get started. Let me just, sorry, I'm taking note of all my colleagues who joined us today.
Counselor Edwards, I sent you a message with the order of the council arrivals, if you can see it.
Thank you so very much.
You're
I will
welcome.
go through that when I go after the introduction. Okay. Candace, could you resend? I don't know that I got the text, or is it email?
I sent it in the Zoom messages, but I can send it to you by text, no problem.
Okay, thank you. I want to make sure.
You're welcome.
Okay. All right. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Oh, let's see the waiting. I'll start and then I'll check in the waiting room afterwards. All right, everyone. My name is Lydia Edwards. I'm chair of the Government Ops Committee. Today is Friday, May 15th, 2020. It's 10 a.m. ish. And the City Council on Government Ops is holding a virtual hearing on Zoom on docket 0643. Order for a hearing to explore preparation for the upcoming 2020 elections, in September and November. I am the chair of this committee. However, this matter was sponsored by District City Councilor Matt O'Malley. The City Council may have a quorum participating due to the standing committees, but attendance in accordance with Governor Baker's March 12th executive order is modified certain requirements for the open meeting law and allows us to meet online or through Zoom. This enables us to continue out our regular responsibilities while adhering to public health accommodations. The public may watch this hearing via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-TV. It will also be rebroadcasted at a later date on Comcast 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964. Public testimony is, you may submit it through written comments to the committee directly. You may also participate in today's hearing via Zoom. If you wish to testify, you should email the staff for a link and instructions to do so no later than the end of business day before this hearing. The staff email or the committee email is ccc.go@boston.gov. So I'm going to also introduce my colleagues in order of their arrival, and that'll be the order in which we are going to collect their, or have them testify or ask questions. We'll then go to, I'll turn it over to the sponsor of this matter after I also note who's going to be participating for the administration. Okay. In order of their arrival, we have, of course, the sponsor, Councilor O'Malley. Then we have City Council President Janey. We have Councilor Wu, Councilor Campbell, Councilor Braden, Councilor Flaherty, Councilor Bach, and Councilor Mejia. In terms of those who are participating for the administration, I want to thank Commissioner Ineida Tavares and also Head Assistant Registrar of the Elections Department, Sabina Pimonte. I believe they're both here ready to testify. There have also been organizations invited, Mass Vote, who will be represented by Alex in a later panel. For now, there will be public testimony, and I will acknowledge those folks after we get to them. We're going to allow for one round of introductory remarks, and then the sponsor of this matter will take it away. That's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and actually turn it over to the sponsor for his introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for your incredible support and quick turnaround of getting this scheduled. Obviously, time is of the essence. I want all of us on this call to just sort of go back to March 3rd of this year. It was the state presidential preference primary. Many of us were at the polls. We were aware of COVID-19, but it really hadn't impacted us the way that it was affecting European countries and some Asian countries. But we sort of knew it was coming, but it was a typical election day, if relatively uneventful. Kudos, as always, to the Boston Elections Department for a remarkable job with that election, as well as the early vote that led up to that election. And then 1 month after that, 1 month after our election on our presidential primary on March 3rd, was the Wisconsin presidential primary. And this was actually 5 weeks, I guess. The date was April 7th. And I remember seeing the images, and it was criminal. You had people being forced to line up, queue up in line to go vote, to wait. This was the early days of most of the stay-at-home advisories, certainly in Massachusetts, certainly in Wisconsin, several other states. You had a governor of a state trying to prevent the election, and he was thwarted by judges who and a Republican-led legislature which refused to budge because, well, I won't posit why they wanted to go forward. But you had a city like Madison, Wisconsin, slightly smaller than Boston, but a medium-sized city where typically 154 voting locations, there were 6 or 8 that were actually opened up because they couldn't get people to staff them. It was terrifying to watch as a local elected official, and it inspired me to call for this hearing order to figure out how we can provide safe ways to vote in September for our Democratic primary, and then November 3rd, of course, the presidential election. In that time, you have seen a number of strategies employed by states. There are 4 states right now that, or before a week ago, there were 4 states that would do an all vote by mail election. Colorado, Oregon, Washington State. California recently, just last week, announced that a city of 54 or however many million people, announced that they would be doing it as well. So this is a real opportunity. Now, the city of Boston can't control vote by mail elections. This has to come from the state. I'll be honest, Madam Chair, it's incredibly disappointed that we invited the Secretary of State. If he couldn't make it, we asked him to send any representative to continue this conversation. They declined to participate. That's a real problem because we have to be working together with the state. The city can do some things to make it safer. The city ought to do some things to make it, will do some things to make it safer. And I have some ideas, but this really has to be done at the state level. Now, yesterday, there were a number of hearings at the State House, and there's been enormous leadership in the state legislature to try to advance more vote by mail or other opportunities and other techniques to make it safer and increase accessibility to voting. We're going to discuss some of those at today's hearing. We're going to hear some feedback. We're going to figure out how we can support Commissioner Tavares, Registrar Piemonte, and the incredibly talented men and women of the Boston Elections Department. I believe that vote by mail is the best strategy to employ going forward. We also have to expand on some of the successes as it relates to early voting. We want to make it easier. We want to make it safer for folks to vote. Having this conversation now is crucial, and I'm delighted to work. I know I've talked to the mayor, I've talked to the administration. We're all on the same page here. So let's figure out how we can do it, how we can make it work, how we can make it safe. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the panelists for whom we'll be hearing and discussing shortly. I think you're muted, Madam Chair. Oh.
Counselor Janey? Counselor Janey? Can Counselor Janey hear me? Can anyone hear me? No? Okay.
Can hear you.
Okay, then Counselor Wu for introductory remarks. Okay, Counselor Campbell. And we've also been joined by Counselor Sabi George. Counselor
Hi, Counselor
Braden.
Edwards.
Oh, hello.
Hi, good morning. And so thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Councilor O'Malley, for calling for this hearing. It really is disappointing that the Secretary of State's office hasn't sent someone to participate because obviously they play a key role in this conversation. But I also want to thank, of course, our City of Boston election officials who work hard every single day, always are thinking proactively and outside the box to make it easier for folks to participate. This is a timely conversation. I'll add, it was extremely disappointing to watch folks have to literally decide whether or not they're going to keep themselves safe or exercise their right to vote. And we know that this is really intentional with respect to diminishing the vote out of communities of color, immigrant communities. So I'm really excited to think about what we can do from our side to support vote by mail initiatives, of course, early voting, and other ways to make it easier to access the ballot. I also want to thank the advocates who've been, frankly, fighting the fight for a really long time with respect to these issues. And so I want to thank them for their work with us and look forward to a robust hearing. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Councillor Braden, if you had any introductory remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Councillor O'Malley, for bringing this very, very important issue forward. I'm passionate about vote. I come from the systematic disenfranchisement of huge populations, parts of our population in Northern Ireland. And to me, I really feel that if we fail to prepare, we must prepare to fail in this upcoming election. And I'm really glad that the timely opportunity to discuss all the possibilities to maximize voter participation in upcoming elections. This next election in September is probably the most important election. Not September, in November is probably the most important and significant election in our lifetimes. And it's really crucially important that we maximize voter participation and ensure that immigrant communities and communities of color and everyone gets to participate without fear for their health and well-being. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and thanks again for bringing this forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Flaherty, any brief introductory remarks?
Good morning, Madam Chair, and good morning to everybody. I want to thank you for hosting this hearing and also thank our colleague and lead sponsor, Councilman O'Malley. This issue is incredibly important, particularly as we head into a big election cycle this November. And again, I'm grateful for the sponsors for getting this conversation started and for you hosting. This body, as we all know, has led on election and voter access issues. Before many of you have joined the council, I led the effort on behalf of this body with respect to the transliteration of ballots, working with both the Latino and the Chinese community. And just last year alone, as we all recall, we sent 3 election and voter access related home rule petitions up to Beacon Hill. So whether it's been on the transliteration, whether it's been on bilingual ballots, whether it's been on early voting, whether it's been on increasing access to voter registration, we have been there as a body. The Boston City Council has continued to work hard, to make sure that we're doing the best we can for the residents with respect to voter access. So I know that we have a quality team in our election department that's also constantly working to expand voter access. So looking to partner with them to make sure that we provide as much, the most possible access this November, and identify ways that we as a body can help them make sure that this election goes well, goes smooth, and that all folks in every corner of our city feel that they have access to voting. Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, thank you to the lead sponsor, Councilor O'Malley, for bringing this forward.
Thank you very much, Councillor Flaherty. Councillor Bach, do you have any brief introductory remarks?
Yes, I'll be very brief. Thank you, Councillor Edwards. I just wanted to thank Councillor O'Malley for this hearing order and everybody who's joining us today. To me, our elections are so important, and we've talked a lot in COVID about situations that this has highlighted that were already a problem before, and frankly, like election access and maximizing people's opportunity to use the franchise was already an issue. The fact that we're even sitting here talking about how to make an election on September 1st, the day that 3/4 of our city traditionally moves, happen in a maximally safe and efficient way is kind of crazy on the outset. And so I really hope that we can use this opportunity to think not just about how to get not just about how to get back to where we were, but how to really increase the opportunity for participation in our elections. And I also think that this is a moment where folks are seeing that when times are good, it seems like the private side can do everything, and then when times are bad, it's government that comes in and picks up the pieces, and government's really us doing things together. And if we're going to do things together, we need to also make our democratic decisions together with everybody involved. So I know we'll be getting into all the nitty gritty, but that's sort of where I come from on this philosophically. And again, just want to thank everybody, all the advocates and my fellow counselors for being here today.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bach. Councillor Mejia,
Good
any
morning.
brief
Thank you.
opening remarks?
Yep, very brief. Good morning, all.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for hosting. Thank you to Councilor O'Malley for bringing this to the forefront. As many of you know, I won by 1 vote. And so for me, all things that deal with voter engagement and participation and removing barriers for people to be able to utilize their vote as their voice, I'm all in and looking forward to having this conversation, and also making sure that we do so and making sure that folks who do not know how to read or write in their own native language, when we start thinking about the implementation of these mail-in ballots, that we're really uplifting some of those barriers that a lot of people face to begin with. So thank you all. Brief.
Thank you very much, Councillor Mejia. Councillor Sabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the maker for bringing this before us. I look forward to today's conversation, both from the Elections Department, but especially from the advocates. Looking forward to just understanding how we can improve our system, what is within our limits at the city level for municipal elections, and understanding how we can impact what's happening at the state level with election laws statewide. Am disappointed as well that the Secretary of State or an ambassador from that department wasn't able to join us to really understand. I do hope, I'm an optimist that they are watching, but certainly disappointed that they're not in attendance. Thank you, Madam Chair, and look forward to the rest of this hearing.
Councillor Janey, I know I may have skipped over you accidentally. I don't know if you're able to do a brief remark right now. If not, we can, I can get you in the questions. I'm going to go ahead and state my own very brief remarks. And that is simply that I am beyond excited for this conversation. I want to thank Councillor O'Malley for his leadership and his pushing for this. And I'm very, very happy to have this as soon as possible. I think we're talking about how we're going to be a more democratic city, honestly. And the pandemic has forced us to look at all of our institutions and all of the ways in which we interact with the public, and elections should be no different. I think everyone's been very, very polite about the Secretary of State and being disappointed. I would use another D word, and that's disgusted, that he couldn't be bothered to come to this largest city with, I believe, 1 in every 10 voters in the state vote in the city of Boston. And that we are talking about fundamentally changing how we integrate with them. And he isn't lending his expertise or sending somebody from his office to lend their expertise to work with us is beyond disappointing. And I don't know if it's a matter of disdain or just outright dismissal of the Boston City Council. So that's what I have to say about his lack of participation. I do think, though, that there is still an opportunity to have continued conversation. I do hope that he is, or someone from his office is watching, and I do hope that they understand that this is a good thing and a great conversation, and one that can demonstrate incredible leadership. We could be leading most of the cities in the city of Boston, or state of Massachusetts. So I would love for him to be here, or someone from his office. With that, I will turn it over to the chair, or the sponsor of this hearing, and Councillor O'Malley, it's really honestly up to you. If you would, oh, I see we've been joined by Councillor Flynn. Let me just check and see if he has any comments. Councillor Flynn, are you here? Maybe I'll let him get settled, but Councillor O'Malley, I wanted to turn it over to you honestly, and you can direct if you would like the administration to go forward, or public and or colleagues.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate that. If it's all right with everyone here, it'd be great if we could just get into maybe some Q&A with Commissioner Tavares and Registrar Piemonte, and then maybe hear from advocates and then sort of splice in some public testimony. That works.
Very well then, colleagues, as you have heard from the lead sponsor, we're going to go with the administration and then very likely move to the public, and then we will come in afterwards. So turning it over to the administration now for their presentation or comments. And I do see you, Councillor Flynn. Councillor Flynn, can you hear me? Did you want to say some brief introductory remarks before we turned it over?
Thank you, Councillor Edwards. Thank you to the makers. Thank you to the chair of the committee, the administration, the public. I'm also concerned about the upcoming election, but with the focus on our absentee ballots as well, sending them overseas to our military personnel, I'd like to learn more about that process, and persons with disabilities that also request absentee ballots. A lot of our seniors, about how do those ballots get into the hands of the residents effectively so that they can participate in voting. Again, thank you to the administration, and looking forward to the hearing. Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Thank you, Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you very much. I know the administration is ready. Councilor Wu has just pinged me to say that she had stepped away briefly. Would like to have an introductory remark. Councilor Wu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't need to say much. I just wanted to apologize. I was trying to get my son situated on his school Zoom, so was away for a window. I'm really grateful to the sponsor and the chair for making this conversation happen. It is the foundation for all the other issues that we're thinking about. So I'm glad to see Boston stepping up and providing leadership here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Councilor Janey.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I just want to chime in to offer my deep gratitude to the maker. I think this is probably one of the biggest issues facing us this year's election cycle. I was proud to partner with our former colleague, Councilor Zakim, on a number of initiatives. I'm really proud of the work that this body has been doing. Proud of the work that the advocates have been doing. I am a founding board member of Mass Vote. Anxious to hear recommendations coming from many of the advocates. I think this, again, very important. We've got to make sure that we have an election where people can get access to the polls, whether that be by mail, whether that be through physical distancing, but this is a critical issue. So I want to thank the administration, thank the maker again. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank all of the advocates, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Very well. To the administration.
Good morning, Councilor Edwards and Councilor O'Malley, and all the other city councilors and committee members that are on this Zoom meeting. Thank you for holding this hearing today. My name is Zenaida Tavares. I'm the chair of the Board of Election Commissioners, and I have here with me Head Assistant Registrar of Voters, Sabina Piemonte. We are here today to discuss the preliminary efforts the department is taking to address the concerns for conducting the 2020 elections. As everyone here knows, here in the election department, we believe that elections are the cornerstone of democracy and should be executed in a manner that would provide fair, safe, and equitable elections for all voters. As you are aware, there were a number of election bills heard before the Joint Committee on Election Laws yesterday, and any final preparations for the upcoming election would be determined by any legislative changes that may be coming down the pipeline. So we are here to answer any questions about any concerns, any of the preparations that we have been doing to address concerns for the upcoming election.
Thank you very much. Councilor O'Malley, did you want us to go right to the next panel of advocates?
Well, perhaps we could do maybe a quick round of questions with the administration and the advocates, if that's all right, Madam Chair.
Yes, back to you, Councilor O'Malley. Yes.
Thank you, and thank you, advocates. I do want to hear from you, but maybe just to sort of, there's a lot of moving parts here, so it'd be great just to verify that we're on the same page. Commish, Registrar Piemonte, welcome. Thank you for your great work. There are no special elections scheduled on the books in Boston before September 1st, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so the next election we'll be looking at would be the Democratic primary on September 1st, which as has been mentioned by a number of colleagues, poses a whole host of challenges, notwithstanding COVID-19. So I misspoke in my opening remarks. I said it was 4 states. It's actually 5 states, Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, and Utah, which allow all vote by mail elections. There are 21 additional states which allow certain smaller elections to be conducted completely by mail. And what this means is that ballots are mailed to individuals and then they're returned, filled out. Participation rate skyrockets compared to having to go to a place. Not only do we not have that currently in the Commonwealth, but it's very difficult to legally vote by absentee. We do not have no excuse absentee voting in this Commonwealth. You need to have an excuse as to why you can't visit your poll. I know you guys know these things. I'm just providing some background for those who may be watching. Now that has been changed somewhat. I think there have been a handful of special elections throughout the Commonwealth since we found ourselves amidst pandemic. And it is somewhat easier now to get an absentee ballot, but there still are hurdles. So there's been quite a flurry of activity, which again, I'm very supportive of at the state level, which would allow an all vote by mail election. Commish, do you have any sort of insight? I know there were some hearings yesterday. I don't believe action's been taken, but just sort of where we are, or any thoughts on vote by mail and what it would take to be deployed for a city like ours, which has, I mean, how many registered voters in Boston? 250, 280,000?
417,291.
Okay.
So
It's significant. But can you talk a little bit about what happened yesterday at the State House, or any thoughts you and the department has regarding vote by mail?
I think if we were to move to a full vote by mail system, that would cause a significant strain operationally on the election department. And I think given the time frame that we would have to implement a full vote by mail system may be a little tricky given the window of time between now and September 1st primary. We don't have the capacity for central tabulation right now. That means that any ballots that are returned, we still have to deploy to the precincts to be counted there. And we have a number of voters, 52,000 of our voters are inactive voters. These voters are eligible to vote. However, Boston is a very transient city and they've become inactive because they didn't respond to our annual city census, which means that they may not live there. So we also have concerns about ballots just being left unattended. And then the other issue is the issue of our unenrolled voters. We have 181,000 voters who are unenrolled. So before a primary election, they would have to specify which party ballot they'd like to receive. So that would pose a challenge. So that means that about half of our voters right now would require some sort of ballot confirmation. And we feel that for us, it would be best to do a request by mail. So if they go the route of no excuse absentee voting, if we can do some sort of marketing campaign just to encourage voters to request their ballot by mail, that would probably be the ideal situation for the election department at the moment.
No, so I certainly am sensitive to the challenges, and there of course would be an increased cost, there would be an increased strain. We would need to hire more staff for your crew to make sure that this would be able to be done, even if it were to be the request by mail. Elections cost money. Elections, you know, I for one think it's perhaps one of the more important investments we can make. But I certainly take your point. I think statutorily there are several things that we could do at the state level which wouldn't need any law change. It could be simply the promulgations, you know, that the secretary puts out in terms of deploying the precincts, the votes to the precincts to be tabulated there. It is my understanding that the secretary could change that rule, just and that would at least make the thing somewhat easier for tabulation.
Correct. However, I don't think that they have a high-speed tabulator that would be compatible with the voting machines that we currently use, which would be another issue that we would run across. We would still be required to set up multiple machines and find a rather large location and hire hundreds of volunteers that would have to work within close proximity to one another to help process these ballots.
You know, I mean, there's no question there are challenges here. I would never suggest that this is something that could be easily done. There's a lot of play here, and I want to get to some other matters, but just to sort of close the loop for this round of questioning as it relates to vote by mail, allowing for, what would we need to change the, what would we need to have no excuse vote by early absentee voting? Would that have to be a state law change, or could that just be the Secretary of State making it easier with a?
That would have to be a state law change, and I believe in his proposal, it does call for no excuse absentee voting.
Okay, so theoretically, we could then either, we could theoretically, I'm not suggesting that we would, but if there's no action or not sufficient action at the state level, we could send an absentee ballot to all, absentee ballot request to all 492,000 registered voters in Boston.
That's correct.
And obviously there'd be a significant cost of printing and postage, but we could do that. And that would then, if you're unenrolled, you would have to specify which party ballot you'd like. So that could sort of solve that problem. We could make it more of an opt-in system. And I wonder if that might be an approach that we should look at for September. Again, if there's not more action taken, just mailing every registered voter in Boston a absentee ballot application. We would also allow for election day voting in certain areas in our locations. And then I believe that you're going to continue to offer early voting for the state primary in September. Is that correct?
That would require a lot of legislative changes as well. So right now, early voting is only available for the general election.
You're kidding. Even though we had it for the presidential primary in March, we allowed for early voting, but
That's correct. That was the first time early voting was held for a primary election.
And that's dictated at the state level?
That's correct.
Okay. So is there a movement? I would hope the answer is yes, that there's also a movement afoot at the state level to address that? Because
yes, there is.
Okay. And again, I appreciate that. And for those watching, I want everyone to know the Boston Elections Commissioner does not dictate these rules. These are by the state secretary of the Commonwealth. And again, it's very disappointing that neither he nor a representative is here to sort of help give us some clarity. But if we could mail out absentee ballot applications, if we could support efforts at the state level to allow for early voting and maintain our typical election day procedures, I think that's a very good step to both increase voter participation and allow the peace of mind for individuals that they can vote in a safe way at their choosing. The mayor said very strongly, and something that I very much support, that we're limiting large social gatherings between now and I believe it's Labor Day. And this primary would take place before Labor Day. And if any of you have been to Holy Name, a quadruple precinct in West Roxbury on Election Day, you know it is always a very, very large active place. So I think anything we can do to address that and ameliorate that ahead of time is the right approach. So I guess I'll conclude for this round so my colleagues can have a chance. But Commissioner, is there any thought of just mailing all of our registered voters an absentee ballot application and sort of seeing what that yields?
Yes, that would be the ideal situation, and that's something that we're willing to do here in the election department. Another piece to the mail-in process is if we have early voting. Right now, the current law states that we can't mail ballots until the first day of early voting. He would need to be able to mail these ballots to voters as soon as they become available. So not sitting and waiting until, the start of early voting. If we have 100,000 requests, we want to be able to just send those ballots out as soon as we get the ballots.
Great. And did you see, I guess this is my last question for this round. Was there an increase in absentee ballot requests for the March presidential preference primary?
No.
To earlier, so okay. Again, it was probably too early in the pandemic to.
We also had early voting for the primary, so.
Yeah. And there was pretty good participation for that, right?
Yes.
Right. Okay. You've been very kind letting me go over, Madam Chair. I do have more questions, but I'll yield to my colleagues after this first round. Thank you.
Lydia, I think you're on mute, Madam Chair. You're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Janey. For my colleagues, I did allow for the lead sponsor to go a little over time. I will be strict with everyone else's time, including my own, to allow for the rounds and for the advocates to also participate. Up next is Councilor Janey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for the opening presentation. I can certainly appreciate, I have a new appreciation for the work that the Elections Department does since 2017. So thank you for the incredible work that you guys do. I certainly can appreciate the strain of changing to a new system like mail-in ballots would present, particularly in the first year. Through research, we found that in Colorado, in the long term, they saw a reduction in cost. So while there could be a strain in terms of staff capacity or some initial costs that we would have to undertake if we moved to such a system, I think in the long run, it would still be very beneficial. I would be interested in your thoughts of some sort of combination, because I don't view this as kind of just a silver bullet approach. I think there are probably multiple things that we have to look at. So in addition to, like, I would be interested in a combination of mail-in ballots with a no-fault early voting for an expanded period of time, for example. Again, understanding that these decisions happen at the state level, I do believe that we have we have power as a council and as advocates to influence those decisions. And so I would be interested in your thoughts, just from the administration's point of view, of what some sort of combination of mail-in with early voting. We already have low turnout, in our city. And so we really need to get the numbers up and make sure that people have free access, fair and free access to voting. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on some sort of combination.
So I'm assuming that you're referring to in-person early voting?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
so
obviously with physical distancing, but I think the more we expand that out, either through offering, different locations, more locations, as well as expanding it out in the calendar, the more we can physical distance with that, as well as a combination of mail-in ballots. The more we can expand voting, I think the better.
Yes, I agree. And with the mail-in early voting, there has to come the in-person early voting aspect. Even if it's just here at City Hall, we would have to designate at least one in-person early voting site. I think we've done a great job of expanding it out. And again, any of our final decisions in terms of sites and the length of time we'll hold early voting will have to be based on any legislative decisions.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I think, the good thing about having this conversation now is that we're in our budget discussions. And so I would be interested in just thinking and planning out different scenarios should we be successful in changing things at the state, whether it's through the Secretary of State or through legislation. I would want to have some scenarios and have a sense of what each of those scenarios cost, so that we, as we're having our budget discussions, we can make sure that if there's any kind of significant change, perhaps we can make sure that there's resources available to cover that. So I'm interested in what would it look like, or what your best thinking is on some sort of combination, whatever your best thinking is on how we can expand access to voting. I believe to do that, we need to be looking at early voting and mail-in ballots. And so I'd be interested, do you share that? And then
yes, we do share that.
Yeah, what ways are there different scenarios that you would look at that might cost this in terms of staff time and in terms of dollars? And if we looked at scenario B, it might look like this with staff time and dollars. And if we looked at scenario C, is that something you're thinking about, different scenarios that could play out?
We are going to look into different scenarios that are going to play out. At the moment, we are looking for actual locations that would be willing to host us for September and November. Even though September is up in the air and we don't know if we're going to have early voting, we are reaching out to sites to see if they would be available to host us for September. So that would be the first step. And then once we find locations that are willing to host us, we can try to work around what that schedule would look like. whether we'll be out in the communities, how many days we'll be out in the communities, and which communities they would be.
Right. And, you know, I think however we think about voting, mail-in, in person, you know, language access and how, you know, thinking about our polling locations, many of them are in school buildings, many of them are in senior buildings. Are these the places we want to continue to have as our polling locations? Like, I'm really interested. Oh, I see Madam Chair is giving me the hook, like this is the Apollo. So I will wait for the next round, but I would be interested in how we are thinking about our polling locations in the age of COVID-19, again, with the goal of expanding access. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Wu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. So just thinking about how we're planning ahead, you know, not this election cycle, but next ones, potential special elections, et cetera. What does it look like in terms of budget costs for the city, you know, to let's say the universe of people that would receive a mail-in ballot in a potential preliminary versus final, and what are some of the kind of further logistical considerations there? And I know that, you know, understanding that the commissioner had already said that it would probably be too tight to do it for this upcoming election cycle, but just sort of absent the time constraints.
So a typical election costs us about $750,000 to $800,000. We have never done the mail-in piece, so we're not sure exactly what that cost would be at the moment, and any added costs of any safety measures that we would have to put in place, say protective gear for our election officers or any things of that nature that we'll have to implement in these upcoming elections. So those are added costs that we have not calculated yet.
Okay, and then in terms of technology, are there specific systems that, you know, I know we're always concerned about security, election security, but thinking through other mechanisms that sort of nationally different elections departments are looking into if this pandemic and physical distancing will continue?
Those are things that would have to come from the Secretary of State's office as well. They are in control of the database that we use, and any access would have to come through them. We currently don't even have access. All of our staff members are required to come in the office to process voter registrations, absentee ballot applications, because we simply just don't have access to that system.
Okay, and then my last question is, let's just say that there was a way, you know, whether funding from the state or federal government, but there was a way to do mail-in voting where everyone automatically got a ballot. Does the city have enough information now to know exactly which voters would be ideally receiving bilingual ballots in different languages, or would that have to be an additional request process for language access?
That would have to be an additional request process for language access. I have thought through this a little bit. If we were to do a full vote by mail system, on election day, we typically have a interpreters table here in the office, staffed with a variety of different languages. I think it's about 11 to 12. And that's something that we can consider maybe staffing during the entire time frame of early voting. And just making sure that there's some sort of dial-in system at the very least that voters can use if they need assistance with their ballot.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I'm going to now turn it over to Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Tavares and your team for all the work you're doing. I don't have a lot of questions, actually. I think I can wait for the advocates and just give my time to them. I'm looking at the time, so that's fine. And many of my questions are similar to my colleagues. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Councillor Campbell. Councillor Braden.
I'm anxious to hear from the advocates as well. I think Alston Brighton has particular challenges. District 9, we have a huge transient population that changes address on September 1st. And with the primary being held on September 1st, that's a huge challenge all round. And it's just of great concern that we make sure we have a good plan to address that issue coming up. But I won't take too much time now. I'd rather hear from the advocates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Braden. Councillor Flaherty. Councillor Flaherty. I understand there may be a connection issue. So Councillor Bach may have, she did warn me that she has to wait till the end. So we have Councillor Mejia, then Councillor Sabi George, and then Councillor Flynn.
Good morning.
There you go.
All right. I am also just as anxiously waiting to hear from the advocates. I just have a few questions. If we are looking at the possibility of an all vote by mail election, what measures are we putting in place now to make sure that outreach is being done to communities with historically low voter turnout to inform them of these changes and the new ways it is easier for them to make their voices heard? And I'm just also curious as how are we making sure that communities who don't speak English are being activated when it comes time to vote? And how are we making sure that the ballots we send out are properly translated? I know that there's a lot of confusion with translation. I think sometimes things get lost in translation. So just being really clear about just the cultural competency piece in translation. And there's a lot of confusion out there about how the upcoming elections will be handled, especially with some people in the federal government suggesting the election may even be postponed. What is being done now to inform people of what is changing and what isn't?
I'll just turn that over to the administration for any thoughts, suggestions, any outreach that they're doing now.
Thank you, Councillor. We currently don't know what the changes are going to be, so we do have to wait for the legislative decisions before we know one way or another what changes are going to be taking place before the upcoming elections. And then in terms of the language, the ballot translation, we currently only translate ballots into Chinese and Vietnamese and Spanish. So those are the 3 different languages that are available, and it's for election day ballots only at the moment and not for absentee ballots. Those are not translated. And that's something that would have to come from the state level before we can actually translate ballots.
Yeah, so in terms of translation, though, I'm just really curious about it, and maybe this is something on the state level. I think that we need to reevaluate even those translations, because I know on our ballots it said write in name, and it was a little bit misleading for some folks who didn't understand that translation. They thought that you had to write the person's name in again. So there's just some discrepancies already existing with the ballots that we have. I'm just curious, as we start thinking about this mail-in ballot opportunities, that we just need to, I just want to advocate that we are a little bit more mindful about making sure that those translations don't get lost in the translation in general.
Yeah. For the municipal elections, we have a little bit more control on those. So I think going forward, we will take every preventative measure to maybe try and have a variety of different groups look at these translations before we actually go ahead and print the ballots.
That would be great.
Any other questions, Councillor?
No, I'm being really mindful of time. This is not about me, it's about we. So get to the public comments.
Oh, very well then. But before we go there, we're going to go to Councillor Sabi George, then Flynn, and then myself.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you everyone again who's here today. I am curious from the Elections Department what the appetite is for change. It seems that there's some hesitation. I understand the focus right now is on September and making sure that we have safe a safe process on September 1st so that people can remain distant. And we're looking at voting locations that are in senior buildings and in school buildings, and how do we keep those populations safe. But I am curious because there seems to be some hesitation in the appetite for changes in the elections department, whether again it's for September, November, or elections going forward. So I'm curious to hear what the desire is of the elections department. And that will be it for me for questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Sabi George. Didn't know if the elections department had a response.
Well, I think we definitely embrace change here. We would definitely like to get to a point where the elections is not such a manual and labor intensive process. And there's just so many changes that would have to take place before we can even come to that point. But if it comes to a point where we have an infrastructure that can handle the full vote by mail system and we have central tabulation, then we would be happy to embrace that here in the election department.
Thank you very much. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Edwards. Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner, I just have a couple quick questions or points. Had a productive meeting with some residents recently from Fort Point in South Boston about the 6-1 precinct, Ward 6, Precinct 1. Basically, it goes from the Condon School all the way down to the South Boston waterfront in Fort Point. Again, productive meeting. Their long-term goal, even short-term goal, is getting a voting location in and around the Fort Point or waterfront area. Probably won't happen this time, but it's a topic for another discussion, but something I definitely support. And thank you for your work on that issue. And then my other point or question is, as it relates to absentee ballots, sending them overseas to our military, what would the time frame be that you would have a cutoff that you would need to send the ballot out to them? And how would you determine if what party or ballot they would want, whether it's a unenrolled or Democrat, or what would your thinking be on absentee ballots to the military, and how would you communicate with them in determining which ballot they would want?
The military voters have the ability to make their request online, so the communication is a lot easier when it comes to the military and overseas voters. If you're referring to a full vote by mail system, I think we'd still have to identify how we would mail or even reach out to figure out all of the military members that are residents of the city in order to be able to reach out to them and actually knowing where they're stationed so that we can send that communication to them. That's a piece that we haven't really thought through yet.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. And in terms of requesting an application for an absentee ballot, how is that process, and what languages do we actually have the application to for people to apply for an absentee ballot?
For municipal elections, it's 4 languages that we have available. But for the state elections, it's just English and Spanish, excuse me.
English and Spanish to request an absentee ballot.
Actually, the applications are in all 4 languages. However, for the translated ballots for the state elections, there's only 1 language available. They're just in English. But for municipal elections, we've gone further and translated our absentee ballot applications to allow voters to be able to select whether they want to receive a Chinese or Vietnamese ballot, or it's automatically translated. Yep. So it's automatically translated to Spanish, but we've gone further for the municipal elections that we have a little bit more control over. But for the state elections, again, that's something that they would have to decide.
Do you know if that's currently being discussed now at the State House, of having more access to language access as it relates to the application and the actual absentee ballot itself?
The applications are available in a variety of languages, in 4 different languages, but the ballot for state elections are not. And I'm not sure whether or not the conversation is going on up on the state level.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Dr. Flynn,
thank you,
are you all
Councilor.
set?
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you,
I'm
Councilor.
gonna put myself,
Thank you, Commissioner.
I'm gonna put myself on a timer very quickly, and just have some follow-up sweeping questions. If I understand correctly, Councilor O'Malley proposed that one thing we could do as a city is just put out applications for absentee ballots, because we couldn't just outright put out and my understanding is those would only go to registered voters. Commissioner?
That's correct. We would send it to
Okay.
registered voters. However, if someone needed to, they can make copies of the application. And we also use written requests. So it doesn't have to be a request by application. You can simply just write a brief note stating that you'd like an absentee ballot and put your information on there, and we would accept that as well with your signature.
Okay. I personally think it's a wonderful equalizer in this moment, because one of the biggest concerns I have is that, as mentioned before, there's some people who, just depending on where they live and how they operate, they've gone to the Cape, for example, for the summer. They may just come back in here, vote once and go and leave. People have different burdens and different stresses in their lives to go vote. And this might be the great equalizer in voting, in that everyone can request a ballot and everyone's going to get that request. So I fully support it, and I hope that that's something that will happen. But I am curious, before we even get to that step, how are we making sure more people are registered to vote in Boston? What are we doing in terms of outreach to make sure that folks who are just moving in, folks who are starting school, all of those different kinds of populations, if we're so transient, what are we doing to basically say, register here? This is how you register to vote, register online or register whatever. That's my first question. So how do we expand the voter registration pool in order to do this idea, I think, of expanding who gets the request for the absentee ballots? And then I also wanted to just ask, in terms of the translation, who evaluates and says this translation is good to go, that this is universal and understood by most people? So that's my second question. And then finally, if we have if this works out, which I hope it does, and if we end up having a lot of people get these ballots in advance, is there an opportunity to make this permanent, that every election, going forward, all registered voters in Boston will get a absentee ballot application? That's the 3 questions.
Well, to your last point, I hope that at some point we do maybe move to a vote by mail system. But if in terms of it being something that we do for every election, would have to depend on the legislation again and what they decide they want to do. If these changes that they make are just temporary changes, or whether they're going to be permanent changes, and that's how we're going to do things going forward. And with respect to the voter registration, we have seen a huge increase in our voter registration with automatic voter registration since January. So that seems to be a process that's working very well. We have been working very closely with BPS. We typically go out to all of the high schools and register students there. With COVID, it's been a little bit of a challenge, and we're exploring ways where we can actually teach the students how to conduct these registration drives, and it's something that they can become a little bit more independent in, so that they're conducting the registration drives on their own, but still relaying that information to us so that we can track the progress that we're making in terms of increasing voter registration. And then we also provide registration to our community centers and libraries, but I'm going to let Sabina talk a little bit about the translation of the ballots and how we determine, or who has the final say in the translation.
Before Sabino goes, because I'm looking at my own time going down, I just wanted to clarify, Commissioner, what I was hoping to make permanent is the applications going out every single election for an absentee ballot. I understand that that doesn't require legislative action. Am I correct?
Well, right now, the qualification for an absentee ballot would be if you're absent from your city or town, have a physical disability that prevents you from going to the polls, or have a religious belief that prevents you from going to the polls. So unless we have no excuse absentee voting, we wouldn't just be able to mail an application to every single registered voter. So there would have to be some sort of legislative changes before we can send an application to all registered voters. Or if it's a situation where early voting is available, then maybe we can send the applications to encourage those who want to vote early to fill out an application. But that would also require changes to allow us to mail the ballots a lot sooner. Because if we have a 2-week time period for early voting and we have to wait until that first day of early voting to mail the ballots, we are just going to get slammed with ballots coming back, and actually the mailroom will get slammed with the ballots that are actually going out. We could have hundreds of thousands of ballots just going out at once and coming back at once.
Very well, thank you. Sabino, I don't know if you were available. You can, I don't know if Sabino was available. I can follow up on the translation. It was just a.
Can you hear me? I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so in regards to translations, most translations are consistent from year to year. Slight changes that have to be made. So there's not a lot that needs to be constantly reviewed. In regards to what Council Mejia had made, that is something that we can do internally to try to clarify some instructions on the voters on that part. Transliteration of names is a little bit more intense, where we have a worker in our office that speaks very fluent Chinese. He pretty much takes over the transliteration of the actual candidates' names, and we then send those out to the Chinese community to do a review, as well as other folks that we've established within the organization of the city to review these transliterated names to make sure they're not, they mean what they're supposed to be meaning. Again, transliteration is the use of phonetic symbols to make a sound that sounds like in the English language, to try to help the folks that use that language to express what they're reading.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So Councilor O'Malley, it's honestly up to you. Do you want to do a second round of colleagues, or would you like to move on?
Madam Chair, with your blessing, why don't we do mass vote, some of the public testimony, and then get to another round? I do have more specific questions, but I'd love to hear from some of our advocates.
Very well, thank you very much. We, as Councilor O'Malley alluded to, we have some folks who are here from Mass Vote. I believe I have an Alex from Mass Vote. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. And you'll be testifying on behalf of the organization. We also have public testimony, or some folks from different organizations. Beth Wong from Mass Voter Table. Beth, I don't know, Beth. I also have Richard Giordano from the Fenway CDC, Jaya Iyer, and Tom Reddy. So we'll go ahead, Alex.
Hi there. So thank you everybody for holding this today. I really appreciate you guys bringing attention to this very urgent issue. As the case of Wisconsin shows, we must begin strengthening our elections in the era of COVID-19 as quickly as possible. Bracing our elections for COVID-19 requires a two-pronged approach, revolving around not only implementing the necessary reforms, but carrying out a vast public education campaign on how these reforms impact voters. While Beacon Hill deliberates over what our elections will look like this fall, Boston must consider how its own elections will function. Specifically, it should strive to mail ballots to all voters in the November general election. Even though it cannot do so on its own without state action, it should nevertheless advocate that such state action should take place. In the September primary, meanwhile, the city can act independently to mail all voters an application to vote absentee, as you have already heard today. The City Council should know that nearly $50 million are available for the state to draw from the federal government to make this transition possible. The bill that Mass Vote has endorsed, HD 5075, places the burden not on local election officials, but the Secretary of State to provide municipalities the tools they need to vote by mail. Technologies like high-speed scanners and secure drop boxes exist to make the transition to vote by mail possible. Furthermore, signature verification systems and 24/7 video surveillance of ballot counting centers ensure that the process remains secure and transparent throughout. Cases of election fraud, meanwhile, are virtually non-existent. In a recent poll conducted by Suffolk University, WGBH, and the Boston Globe, 74% of Massachusetts residents support vote by mail. 74%. This isn't partisan, it's practical. In sum, when it comes to vote by mail, cost isn't an impossible hurdle to overcome. Infrastructure isn't an impossible hurdle to overcome. And security is most certainly not an impossible hurdle to overcome. The people are behind it, advocates are behind it, and now election officials must get behind it. Alongside this, the city must also strive to protect the in-person voting process. For example, Boston may consider consolidating in-person voting operations by transitioning from traditional polling locations to voting centers, which have become the norm in states with vote by mail. However, the city must ensure that underrepresented communities still have easy access to in-person voting locations. The city must also strive to expand the traditional early voting period to limit crowding on election day. Wherever in-person voting does take place, election workers must receive personal protective equipment and sanitizing supplies. They must also enforce social distancing. Yet when it comes to staffing in-person voting locations, the city must go beyond depending on traditional demographics that serve as election workers. Instead, the city should collaborate with local colleges and universities, turning to their vast student bodies and encouraging them to serve as election workers. This may thrive in addition to the robust high school poll worker program that already exists. All of these proposed reforms that the city of Boston should strive to implement. But the city must not stop here. Instead, Boston must carry out a public education campaign to adequately prepare voters for what elections in the age of COVID-19 will look like. Since Boston possesses a high renter population that moves frequently, the city must not only inform voters that they should automatically receive a ballot if such a situation arises, but walk them through how they may request one if they do not receive it. Additionally, the city must target its public education efforts on areas that all too often see their views and interests go ignored, like Chinatown and East Boston. The COVID-19 crisis has hit low-income and minority communities hardest, making it even more important that they have their voices heard. while Beacon Hill continues to consider how our elections will operate this fall, Boston has a chance to lead the state by example. Through striving to implement these reforms, as well as coordinating a public education campaign, the city may ensure that the September and November elections take place in the most safe, secure, inclusive, and accessible manner possible. I am happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna check one more time. We might have a couple of them testify, if that's okay with the.
Oh, absolutely, yes, of course.
Counselor O'Malley, if that's okay. All right, just checking.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks. Just confirming, I see Jaya Iyer and wondering if mass voter table is on.
No, I'm representing Fenway CDC along with Rich.
Okay, well, would you're free to go ahead.
Okay, well, most of my questions, I'm Jaya Iyer, I'm the community organizer for Fenway CDC. We're a community development corporation located right in the Fenway, and like so many other neighborhoods in Boston, we've been very much impacted by COVID-19, in addition to the student population leaving the neighborhood with the closures of the universities. Our small businesses have definitely suffered, and my work around the census has particularly been strained. So the elections are close to home in that sense. And thinking as well about our non-English speaking communities and immigrant populations, ensuring easy access to elections is of the utmost importance. That being said, most of my questions that I had prepared have been answered by you all. But I really do want to emphasize that having a mail-in option, or, at least publicizing early voting, particularly for the general election, is really critical. I've come across a lot of our residents in the Fenway having lots of questions about voting, to a degree that there shouldn't be, especially with an election, both in September and in November, that are so critical for our state and for the country as a whole. I want to encourage and emphasize that coming up with a solution that's both safe in terms of our community's public health and effective in terms of ensuring folks have the right to vote and have that option is very critical, particularly with the marginalized communities that exist in the Fenway. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe Tom Reddy.
Yes, I'm right here, Counselor.
Okay, if you have some questions or brief remarks or.
I do, thank you. My name is Tom Reddy, and I'm with the Fort Point Neighborhood Association, and I'm also a poll worker in Precinct 6-2. So my comments are focused on in-person voting and what I would describe as extra large or supersized precincts and polling locations. So just a little bit of data, because I think data always shapes the conversation. The typical precinct in the city is about 1,600 voters. And in my written comments, I've kind of broken out the top 5 precincts in the city. The top is precinct 3-8 with 6,600 voters. My particular precinct 6-1 is second with 6,300 voters, and it kind of tears down with the 5th being precinct 3-7 with 3,900. So as you can see, there is 2 or 3 precincts that are supersized, I guess is a way to describe it, with mine being the second largest in the city, almost 4 times the average. So you take those extra large precincts and then you start to combine them into polling locations, and you start to create what I would describe as an unsafe condition, both for the poll workers and for the voters, when we consider COVID as September and November approach. We have lines in the Condon, which is where I vote and where I work in the March 3rd election, both at the start of the day and the peak times in the afternoon. And I wouldn't necessarily describe that as a high turnout election. And clearly that's without physical social distancing, and we had lines spilling out on the street. So when I look at the polling locations themselves, it's kind of important. And I know Councilor O'Malley mentioned Holy Name, but sorry, Council, it doesn't even make the top 5 in terms of registered voters to a location, right? The average size polling location in the city is just shy of 2,500 registered voters. The Condon, which is where I vote and work, is 4 times that, 10,427 registered voters turn up at the are registered to vote at the Condon, followed by the Jackson Man School, followed by the Wang Y, East Boston High School, and the Honan, the Austin Library. So those 5 would be the supersize, the Honan being the 5th at around 6,000 registered voters. So these have the opportunity to create significantly unsafe conditions with both wait times, proximity to people, the amount of interaction that could be needed if, in fact, some of the solutions being brought forward for in-person voting that offset in-person voting, like early voting and mail-in voting, aren't adopted. So I would just ask that as the council considers alternatives and as they work with Commissioner Tavares and Rich Piemonte on this, right, that they consider these extra large polling locations and precincts as they think about alternatives for September and November. They look at the layouts of those particular locations. They look at the entrances and exits. They understand. They consider where these lines are going to spill out into the street, and they consider staffing. I'd only wrap with, and it was mentioned earlier, unless laws are changed, all votes need to be cast at the particular precincts. With these extra large polling locations and extra large precincts, that puts an undue burden on those particular poll workers. So I would also ask that both the number of poll workers and the number of wardens and clerks gets revisited for those extra large precincts and extra large polling locations. So thank you, Councilor.
Thank you very much. We've also been joined by Ed Cook from Dot the Vote. I didn't know if Mr. Cook, if you wanted to questions, remarks. Mr. Cook? Let's see. Check. Yeah, not in the waiting room, so.
Sorry, Madam Chair. Ed's a friend of mine. Ed, you need to unmute yourself, which is clicking the 3 white dots and hitting unmute.
Ed?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Matt, Councilor O'Malley. So I feel very strongly about universal voting by mail. I live in Ward 15, and there are a lot of obstacles to voters in Ward 15. Among them, English language challenges. Also, we have 2 of the largest, the poorest census tracts in the state. And we have a lot of immigrant voters. And as a result, we have consistently had very low turnout. If you add in the dangers of voting in person, which will keep people away, our state rep, this is just throwing this in here, Liz Miranda, I think 15 or 18 of her family, including her, have been infected with the coronavirus. Her father is hospitalized. And there are a lot of families like hers in Ward 15 and in Dorchester who are terrified of going out in person to do almost anything. And I don't see this changing very much by the time we get to the fall elections. So I would really strongly advocate that we have universal voting by mail in the city, even if the state does not choose to go that way. And that seems likely from what I've read about Secretary of State Galvin and even in communication with some of the local state reps. The House voted to have remote voting to protect themselves, but they don't seem very interested in protecting the rest of us in voting. And so, let's see, I'm just referring to some notes. Is universal voting by mail being considered by the city council right now? I'm sorry, I came into this meeting kind of late.
Mr. Cook, or I'll turn it over to Councilor O'Malley. I see him, he was about to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, thank you, Ed. We're talking about that and some ideas that we have, so we can circle back offline, but really appreciate your leadership on this. And for those, I think perhaps our citywide and certainly Councilors Campbell and Baker would know, Ed has created this great organization called Dot the Vote, which has really been doing some terrific work in voter engagement and activation. So we'll follow up offline, but appreciate your comments.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity, councilors. You're doing a great job. We really appreciate you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cook. We wanted to make sure we got also Richard Giordano. When you're ready, Richard. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Still a little rusty on unmuting at the right time. My name is Richard Giordano. I work at Fenway Community Development Corporation in the Fenway, obviously, as Shea explained who we are. And I want to thank you and Councilor O'Malley and the rest of the council for holding this hearing and bringing up these considerations, and Election Commissioner for being here and doing this work. I consider myself a newbie in terms of all of the complexities of changing this voting system that we have in place. And I think that with the epidemic and the problems that has created, it's obviously given us a new host of problems to deal with. But I think it is an opportunity to make improvements as well. It strikes me that frankly, we all, everyone here on this call, the counselors, the activists, the election department, we're all allies and want to work together on all of this. And I think given all of the various moving pieces that are involved, I think I would like to suggest that the council continue with working sessions, bringing all of us together just like this to discuss the implications of improving the system that we have. How do we get the scanners that we need to do more mail-in? What does that mean for the budget? the issues of the signature verification on the mailing back and forth, and how does that work? The issue of securing drop boxes if we do that, and I think it was Tom or Tim rather, someone who was suggesting video surveillance. There's lots and lots of moving pieces to making improvements, the translations, the outreach into the community. In the Fenway, we have Mandarin speakers, Spanish speakers, and Russian speakers. And as Jay explained, we're trying to do increased outreach to all of those groups for returning the census. So, you know, I think also we need to keep in mind what else is going on at the state and federal level. I know that Representative Eligardo had put in the chat to all of us that the State House was considering a variety of bills and is seeking testimony that I believe closes this afternoon at 5 o'clock. So if folks have thoughts on that, please send them up to the State House. Unfortunately, I think we are the outliers here. We want to encourage more people to vote and participate and figure out ways to do that. And in the rest of the country, there are groups and entities, and in some cases, election commissioners at the state level who want to do the reverse and restrict things. And I think given the problems that the post office is now facing, we also, while it's beyond the purview of a city council, we need to remember that the post office is going to need our help to be able to function the way we expect it to, given what the White House has been saying about how they'd like to see the post office go down. You know, regarding our own work then, if we can continue with working sessions, whether that means papers and emails back and forth, and discussion about the budget and staffing implications. And I particularly thank Tom Reedy for his bringing to light the issue of the physical problems at the polling places. And, you know, going forward, of course, when the census is done, we will have redistricting. And that, I think, we hope means re-precincting, and in some ways letting us put together a more representative and inclusive system. So, you know, I don't have specific questions other than that to ask that somehow we continue together as a group to work on this, whether that means virtually in Zooms or sessions once we're able to go back into, say, the Piemonte room, because there's just so many moving parts, and I really do appreciate the thoughtfulness of all of the participants who've been bringing out how to do improvements. So I just want to thank you, and hope we can continue working together.
Thank you very much, Rich. I would assume now we're good to go back on that second round, Councilor O'Malley.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to everyone who took the time to offer some really great. I took copious notes with everybody and agree with virtually everything that was said. Particularly wanted to thank Mass Vote for that thoughtful testimony and noting that there is federal and state money available to help us undertake this enormous task. And kudos to Rich for sort of highlighting the fact that this is an incredibly enormous issue that we're dealing with. We can't solve it today. We can't solve it tomorrow, but this is going to take some time. So for this round of questioning, I want to go back to Commish and Registrar Piemonte, just to sort of get an understanding. I mean, I absolutely support a total vote by mail. Other states that are similar to, that are smaller than Massachusetts have done it. States that are similar to size of Massachusetts have done it. And now California will be the first incredibly large state, the largest state in the union, that's going to do it for November. Population of California is nearly 10 times what Massachusetts population is. So obviously it can be done. Where there's a will, there's a way. There's no question it's going to take a significant commitment of resources and support and bolstered workforce for our respective elections departments. And I'm really even thinking more of our smaller cities and towns in Massachusetts that would have to process it, but we can do it. And one thing that I'll be doing sort of separate from this is advocating in our budget process to allow for some increased funding for the elections department to be able to deal with this at a minimum, likely heavy increase in absentee ballots. So that's something that I'll be pushing for, and I'm sure my colleagues will as well. Until and unless we get to all vote by mail, which I'm committed to advocating and furthering as long as I'm in this position, it does sound to me that there are some short-term things that we can do as it relates to, the primary election on September 1st. So just so I have this right, I'm thinking at three steps and then an additional one. The first thing, the state has to take action to establish an early vote for a September 1st primary. That's correct. That's correct.
Yes.
So, and the Secretary of State, who again has declined to participate in this hearing, has been very supportive of that. So that's a hopeful sign. So that has to be done. One, early vote, which we've done in a number of elections now in Massachusetts, including the presidential preference primary of March 3rd or March 7th. We had early vote. We need action to be taken at the state to establish an early vote state primary election for September 1st. The second thing, the state has to take action to establish no excuse absentee voting. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. And then once those two things are done, the city could mail absentee ballots to every active registered voter in the city of Boston.
Applications, yes. And I would say if we just have the early voting piece, we can mail early voting applications to all registered voters in the city of Boston.
So at both active and inactive?
Yes.
Great. Which again is about 400 and I lost my notes, but 420,000 or so individuals.
Correct.
Okay, so I mean that we'll need obviously funding for that for printing and postage, but so and are you committed to say the city's willing to do that for the
Yes.
primary? That's fantastic. Now, thank you, Kamish. That's great news, and thank you, Sabino. In 1997, as a freshman at George Washington University, this is a true story, I desperately wanted to vote in a city council election. First time I could vote in a city council election. And I went online to what was a very rudimentary website, actually, funnily enough, designed by Mike Ross, a former counselor who had worked in IT at the time. And I was unable to request an absentee ballot via an online portal. I ended up writing a note. I got my absentee ballot. Been a perfect voter ever since. 23 years later, you still cannot request an absentee ballot through the website. You can request an absentee ballot application, but if the elections department will allow for a written note requesting an absentee ballot and sending one, why wouldn't we allow just a straight absentee ballot request through an online form?
Because we need a signature on that application. And
Wouldn't an electric signature, or who says we need it? Is that a state law that we need a signature on the application?
Yes, it is a state law that we need a signature on the application.
Okay. But if we're going to mail absentee voter applications to every registered voter, why? I guess would you be open to maybe making a change or supporting efforts at the state to change that to allow for an online request?
They are currently looking into creating some sort of a portal where someone can request an absentee ballot.
I just feel like that's such an easier way, sort of low-hanging fruit way to also address a barrier. Right now, so folks that don't know, if you want an absentee ballot, you need to go online, request an absentee ballot application, that's mailed to you, you send that in, then you get the ballot. So if we could just maybe tweak that at the state level, it's good to hear that there's something address that. So then
I just want to say that those forms are available on our website and can be downloaded from either our website and from the Secretary of State's website as well.
No, that's wonderful. But my point is, you can't go online and request an absentee ballot. You can go online
you cannot.
And request an application to request an absentee ballot. I just want to see if we can cut out the middleman, so to speak. But once we're able to do that, so all those three things happen, 2 state actions, 1 city action, then for September 1st, any individual in Boston could vote either via absentee ballot, where they'll be mailed an application, or at an early voting site, or at their usual polling location on election day from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m.
That's correct.
Okay, well, that's very hopeful. I think that will address some of the concerns. Now, I wanted to thank, I forget who it was, someone had brought up, the support of election workers, because I think if you could talk briefly about sort of the PPE that we are going to provide for election workers, as well as ways that we can start advocating and recruiting more wardens. I would venture a guess, having always voted and being an elected official who visits multiple voting locations, that probably most, if not many, if not a majority, certainly a plurality of our election day workers are typically seniors who may not feel comfortable or may have some health conditions that could prevent them from being out on election day. So I guess the question is there a concerted effort of looking at growing the number of election day workers for the fear that, as what happened in Wisconsin, they saw a plummet in the number of typical election day workers. So we can end on, appreciate the support of sort of going through the 3 options for folks to vote on September 1st. And my question then that I'll conclude for this round is, can you talk about PPE that will be provided for election day workers and also recruitment to staff those polling sites on 9/1? Thank you very much, Commissioner.
You're welcome. So we are currently still reviewing and looking into options for PPE. We're thinking of several options. We're looking into shields. I know a lot of states have done plexiglass for their poll workers, where we have 179 polling locations. That may be a little bit of a challenge. So maybe trying to find some face shields, face masks, gloves, hand sanitizers for polling locations, and maybe markers so that they voters know where to stand, and having someone kind of help direct the flow of traffic, be it the officer that's stationed at the location or one of our election officers. Those are things that we are looking at. We're also looking into maybe assembling cleaning teams that may go into a polling location periodically, maybe 15 cleaning teams that would go into a polling location to sanitize about every 3 hours or so. So those are just options that we are exploring at the moment. And once our plans become a little bit more solidified, we will happily communicate that with everyone here. And as we review cost and come up with what all of this is going to cost, we'll also relay that information as well. In terms of election officers, we recruit about 1,800 poll workers to serve on election day. We have started our recruitment process early to get a better sense of those who do not plan to attend, and also to hear of any concerns that can be addressed by the election department to help ease anxiety that some of our poll workers might be experiencing. And as we do anticipate a shortage of election officers, we're exploring different ways to identify college students who may actually live and attend school here in the city of Boston. And I know that I've been in communication with Professor Cobb from Suffolk University about that, to try to gain some resources from all the colleges and universities and not just Suffolk. We are also trying to leverage some of our students from BPS. I know they won't be in school on September 1st, but we do have students who have already served and have the experience in serving. So we're trying to reach out to those students to get them engaged and get them back. We're also hoping that we could have the assistance of the city's legislative body in recruiting some of your campaign workers. As this is not a municipal election year, we feel that would be a great way to try to recruit some of our election officers, because we do have a number of people coming back to us and telling us that they're not willing to serve, and some of them want to see a clear plan first before they're willing to come back, which is why we started the communication a little bit early, just so we can understand what the concerns are out there and how we can address the concerns so that they are returning.
Well, I don't presume to speak for my colleagues, but certainly count on me, and I'm sure they'll agree to help recruit. Who sets the pay rate, the stipend? Is it set by the state or is it set by the city?
That is set by us, and we are planning to increase that pay for September.
Good, yeah. So if you could maybe email us at some point next week, a form explaining or having a link to a web portal, I know we'll push it out to our networks to try to get people. And I'm glad that you're increasing the stipend. I think we absolutely should. Thank you.
So we will be looking for volunteers, not only to serve at the polls, but also we need to think about assembling counting teams, because as we receive a high volume of mail-in ballots, these ballots will still have to be distributed to the polling locations for processing, and we may need to assemble counting teams just to help process those ballots on election day.
I told the team I had more questions, but I just want to comment on that because I found this out during my research. It is, in my opinion, ridiculous that the state law mandates that when we have absentee voters ballots, they need to then go to the particular precinct. It seems like it's an overly burdensome and onerous. And again, I hope that the state changes that just so that it can help with tabulation, particularly as we see an influx in early or absentee votes. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Counselor Janey?
Thank you so much. I wanted to thank everyone again just for their participation. I'm particularly interested in the polling locations, as I indicated in the first round. My experience out, and I hope, things get better, but changing behavior, I think, has been a challenge for us as a society. Just take a look in the supermarkets. It's still hard to get folks to go down the aisles in the right direction. And I worry that come election time, our polling locations could face similar challenges. Would be interested in, additional trainings around this. Obviously, I'm sure those plans are in place, but I guess I can't emphasize enough how difficult it is to change human behavior, even during the crisis. It's just hard for folks to remember. And I think, it's not only important for the poll workers to have the appropriate training and for there to be a good, solid plan in place for that location. I think it's important also for there to be an emphasis on the customer service aspect. I think as hard as everyone works, there have been complaints over the years of folks who are not the most pleasant all the time. And it's, probably due to stress and other things. But I think this election cycle, more than ever, given just what is at stake with the presidential race, but also given the crisis that we're in, and we're likely to see fewer folks. And when they come out and take that risk, if they feel like it's a risk, we don't want them to be turned away and turned off. I'm also just interested, I may have missed it earlier. Are we talking about expanding the number of polling locations? And if so, what kind of burden does that place on the elections department in terms of recruiting all of the poll workers that we need? And then obviously our poll workers are elderly. I heard plans for PPE and equipment, but I don't know if there are other things we're thinking about, because I just worry about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we're not planning on increasing our polling locations or even decreasing the numbers. We're planning on keeping the numbers the same. We feel that if we do try and combine some of our polling locations or limit the polling locations due to the COVID concerns, it may lead to inequitable access to the ballot, which we do not wish to do. So hopefully with the legislative changes, hopefully that will take place and we can just promote the vote by mail, which will decrease the number of people who will show up to our polling locations on election day. But we do not have any plans to increase any of the sites. And we have been in communication with all of our sites, some of our senior buildings. We've reached out to them to see if they've had any concerns so that we can address all of the concerns in advance. And we're also looking into hopefully maybe closing BPS on November 3rd. September 1st is not going to be a concern, but school will be in session on November 3rd. So that's something that we would hopefully like to see.
Thank you, Commissioner. I may have missed it. I had to step away earlier. For the mail-in ballots, you're talking about absentee. We're not talking about this broader notion of doing mail. Just to clarify, that's a clarifying question.
So it would be whatever the voter requests. If we do have early voting for September, then we can mail early voting ballots, because you can vote early by mail.
Right. And would the voter then have to request it, or are we trying to proactively get it out? I'm sorry if I missed it.
Well, it all depends on what the legislature
What we end
decides.
up with. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, one more point I'd like to add. Whatever the decision they come to, I would also like to request all of your assistance in helping to spread the word whenever that final decision comes.
Absolutely. 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 Thank you so much. Thank you again, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wu. You may have stepped away.
Sorry, I was
Counselor-
stuck on mute. I don't have any further questions. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much, Councillor Wu. Councillor Campbell. Councillor Campbell.
Madam Chair. Hi, sorry, I was just actually texting and putting in the chat actually that I have to jump. I have a conflict. So I will send some follow-up questions, but continue to work with Councilor O'Malley and all of you on these pressing issues. Thank you for the ideas. Thank you to the advocates. Thank you to the residents as well. And thank you, Madam Chair, for hosting that hearing so quickly. Stay safe. and
Thank
healthy.
you.
Thank you.
So Councillor Braden, if Councillor Braden's still with us. Yep, Councillor Braden. Okay. So much easier when we have a room when we can actually just see people are physically there. Councillor Flaherty, I think, had to jump. So Councillor Bach.
Yeah, hi, Madam Chair. I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for testifying. I've been in and out, unfortunately, so I don't want to ask questions that have already been answered. I'll just raise the fact that, you know, I think we have in my district a number of senior and affordable housing buildings where we have these polling places. And the fact that the polling place is in the building plays a huge role in voter turnout. Like it's hugely fruitful for those seniors. So you see that at Moorville House in the Fenway, you see that at Amy Lowell in the West End, and then in the affordable housing communities in Mission Park and Mission Maine. And I just I would really emphasize that this just seems to me like either especially with the senior buildings, right? Like either we're gonna need to have really safe protocols for how this is going to work without getting people sick, or if we're shifting to let's get everyone to vote by ballot, by mail-in, like I just think we're going to need a huge education and support campaign around that. And I have seen the limitations of that in the sense that I've seen senior buildings in my district. We actually compared the numbers, and like 2 senior buildings in my district in the West End, one of them has the polling place in the base of the building and one of them doesn't. And you're looking at 40 to 50% participation in a local election versus 10% if you're lucky. I mean, it's just that location-based thing convenience is so huge for getting folks to vote. So I just really want to raise the kind of scale of the challenge I see on this front, and say that I think it's something that whatever we decide to do formally, we're then going to need to have a huge voter support logistical operation, like a real civic operation that we're all going to need to be part of. It's going to have to be super multilingual and super involved. So I just want to raise that as a kind of wraparound support that's going to need to exist in addition to whatever we decide at the regulatory level. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bach. Councillor Asabi George.
Thank you. I do appreciate the efforts of everyone here and the advocates especially. I am curious about the role that the advocates could play in recruitment of volunteers. I think some of them sort of touched on that, but not sure if anyone has anything specifically to share about the volume of potential volunteers that could come out and help on election day, both when we think about the safety precautions that we need to take, but also should we change the way that we do elections. And that's it from me. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again to the maker.
Thank you. To any of the advocates, Mass Vote or Fenway or Ed Cook, if they wanted to comment on Councillor Sabi George's question.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. Mass Vote has a program that some of you may know about called the Young Civic Leaders Program, where we interact with high school students from across Boston, help them become more civically engaged. We not only have people that have participated in that program, but they also, have friends, and everybody knows about that. Mass Vote is an organization that really prides itself on, being based in Boston and advocating heavily for the issues in Boston. We work around the state, but, our roots and our history are linked to Boston. So we not only have those, we could reach to, the high school students. We could also reach out to university students. The city mentioned they're starting to think about that. So that's something definitely that we can think about. We also partner with a lot of other advocacy organizations. Not as many of them have the connection to young people that we do, so we could be doing a lot of heavy lifting on that end. But there are definitely other advocacy organizations that we could partner with as well.
And it's Tom Reddy. I guess I'd weigh in this way. So I would describe the in-person voting on election day as chaotic. So the poll teams show up at 6 a.m. The sites are set up for the most part, but they have to open the polls by 7 a.m. There isn't a lot of time, candidly, to think about different ways of running the particular polling location. How lines are going to be different, integrating new untrained people into that process. So if in fact this is focused on in-person voting and it's focused on safety of voters and safety of poll workers, the approach to training is going to have to be fundamentally different this year. The training that takes place for election workers is a 2 or 3 hour session. It covers the ballot, covers the books, covers how the ballots are cast, right? It doesn't get into the nuances of how a particular polling location is actually run. So it's my 2 cents.
Thank you. I want to apologize to my colleague, Councillor Mejia. I had accidentally skipped her. So I wanted to turn it over to her for her second round of questions.
Yeah, so thank you. And I'm sorry because I have a hard out at 12, so I won't be able to ask any specific questions that I had lined up because I won't be here to listen to what those responses are. But I would just like to thank the elections department for all your hard work and everything that you do to ensure that when it comes to people amplifying their voices through their vote, that we have the opportunity to do so. The only thing that I will urge us to consider as we move towards this whole notion of voting via mail is that it is a rite of passage and it is a ritual for a lot of people to actually go to the polls. I know a lot of elders look to that. So I just really want to be mindful of what the implementation process looks like, as well as want to be super mindful of the fact that when it comes to voting in person, that online, that we're not that we're considerate of the digital divide, and also thinking about the application process when you request an online, if you request a mail-in ballot, that is also a little bit cumbersome. I've seen for some elders, they have to get support from other people to help them fill out the application. So if we can make it easier for people to apply for the mail-in ballot, that would be great as well. But I just want to say thank you for all your hard work. Thank you to the chair. Thank you to Councilor O'Malley for bringing this to the forefront. And I'm sorry that I won't be able to hear any more comments, but have a great day. I'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilor Mejia. And again, my apologies. Councilor Flynn.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Edwards. I also wanted to highlight what Councilor Mejia mentioned. There are challenges for our seniors. There are challenges for our immigrant community, many that don't speak English, but completing the absentee ballot does possess many challenges, where you also need someone else's signature to kind of verify it. And it is a process to complete the absentee ballot, and it does have challenges, especially for our seniors and for people that may not speak English. It can be a difficult process. Having said that, I think if we were to expand on the universal voting, we would need to do a lot of education and outreach to our immigrant community, to our seniors, and giving them as much information as we possibly can, so that they're educated about the process. But again, I think it is challenging to complete that absentee ballot. The other aspect I wanted to highlight is the in-person voting at City Hall is available, and that's something we should highly encourage leading up to Election Day. I know it's open probably for about 7 days or 10 days. And then we also have voting at the actual voting locations prior to that, a week before. Those should also be, we should have a public awareness campaign to try to get as many people to vote before as we can. Having said that, even if you vote in person at City Hall, those physical ballots are not open. They're actually delivered to the voting location that morning, and they're counted later. So it does possess added work for the voting team, for the warden and the warden's team. But there's a lot of factors that we have in front of us, but it'll take all of us to work together and to communicate and to get to some solutions. I think we can do it. I've already reached out to Suffolk University and Emerson College in my district and in Kenzie Box district. They want to be helpful. I have staff as well that speak Cantonese and Mandarin. They also want to be helpful, as I'm sure other counselors and their staff would be helpful. Again, just want to say thank you to the City of Boston Election Department and to my colleagues and to the neighborhood leaders that we see on this call and in the community. They really know about this process as well as anybody, so they should really be heard during this important debate. Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Thank you, Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Just a note to folks, and I will also defer this to the lead sponsor, but it seems that a lot of what we are wanting to do depends on what the State House does in the next couple months. So it might make sense that this conversation, per Richard's suggestion, and I think just the way we've operated, to keep this conversation in a working session, so that if the State House acts, we are coming back to discuss all of the ways and all these suggestions that we have for implementation, hopefully, of either, at least, as you mentioned, Councilor O'Malley, the early vote for the primary. That would be the first step, hopefully, and anything else they've given us to make sure that we continue this conversation, because there's so many things depending on the State House moving. So that's the first comment I wanted to say to everybody. We've been getting wonderful comments from Cheryl from Mass Vote, noting that we need to discuss those voter registration and also folks who are visually impaired, and that needs to happen, period. But I did want to, I think this conversation warrants that, and I would check in with the lead sponsor if that is something he would agree to.
Oh, 100%. I think it's a capital idea, Madam Chair. Cheryl also correctly noted that it's about 2 weeks. I think the Secretary has said that they typically start printing ballots for the primary, the September primary in June. So I am hopeful that we will see some action happening sooner rather than later. I think that the idea of transitioning this to a working session, probably a series of working sessions in the months and weeks ahead. There's a lot of other topics that we, involve that further complicate what any election is going to look like. It is my fervent hope that we have a representative from the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office at our working session, because we are looking to support their efforts and work collaboratively, but there is so much of this oversight that they dictate that we really need to be having better communication. So I absolutely see enormous value in having a working session, perhaps in 3 or 4 weeks after the legislature acts, and then to be able to take it from there. It's very heartening, and I'm very grateful for the men and women of Boston Elections Department, who I know are doing enormously good work, and delighted to hear that we have sort of a three-pronged approach of how we could deal with the primary and certainly the general as well. So thank you.
Thank you. And just to the Elections Department, we had, the City Council had discussed a couple things. One, landlords actually giving their ballots, giving ballots or registration information to their tenants. And I wasn't sure if that was something that we needed as a home rule, or is that something that the city was willing to implement? That would help with, I think, voter registration. As you noted, automatic registration has been extremely helpful. And then also, could you repeat the name of the bill, or the number, the bill number at least, that we should be monitoring and maybe calling the State House about in order to support our efforts of making sure that our elections are safe and as accessible by as many voters as possible?
Alex from Mass Vote. The bill that we have specifically endorsed is HD 5075, sponsored by Reps Mike Moran and John Lawn. There are about 8 or 9 bills under consideration now. Some do more than others, but this is the bill that we believe would make our elections, as safe, secure, accessible, and inclusive as possible. And there's plenty of room for Boston to act within there as well. So that's the bill that we've endorsed, and we encourage you to do the same.
Thank you. To the Elections Department, Commissioner Tavares or Sabino, if we're still there.
We can get the bill number to you. And in terms of the voter registration for landlords, I don't think that would require a home rule petition. That's something that we may have to do, but we can look into that and get further information over to you guys in terms of.
Yeah, as I recall, it was Councilor Zachem, possibly with my with Councilor Wu or myself. I honestly don't recall. He had introduced that, if you recall, Councilor Flynn and those of us who were here in the last session, specifically trying to bring landlords to the table so that when they did have a new tenant and they had a lease, they also presented them with a voter registration information, which I think was another way, another point of contact. And this was Councilor O'Malley. I can't remember if it was the second or third time that he had introduced it. I believe it was an ordinance, and I don't believe it needed a home rule, as the commissioner mentioned. But again, another tool in the toolbox to expand those registered. If anybody with better institutional memory than I could comment on that, I'd really appreciate it. And that's it for me. I'm looking at you, Councilor O'Malley. You have the most institutional memory of all of us here.
I believe I used to be the fresh face on the council. Now I'm the grizzly old man. I believe your recollection is right that Councilor Zachem did introduce that sort of a rule, that an ordinance that would mandate every landlord would provide a voter registration packet as form as part of their packet, that sort of details their rights as a tenant's bill of rights, so to speak. And I'm not sure what the status is. I believe the mayor signed it and it's in law. I don't know that what the oversight has been, but either way, it's a good opportunity to include this at our next working session. Maybe have someone from DND or whichever relevant city department would maybe be keeping better tabs on that. Thank you.
Wonderful.
I'm sorry, if I could just add to that.
Yes.
Councilor Edwards, if we could somehow encourage them to have their tenants completing the annual census, that would be something that would be very helpful to the election department as well, and helping to maintain their active voting status.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think that we're in 2020, and as we all know, September especially is one of the biggest move in, move out dates. So encouraging both, register to vote. Please be sure to sign up for the census. You've moved, so on and so forth, or fill out the census. So unless anyone has any other burning comments or questions for the administration, I'm going to go back to my colleagues for any conclusionary remarks, and we will end today's session. And I think we will continue this conversation pending action from the State House. So I will turn it back over to Councilor O'Malley if you'd like to go first, or if you'd like to conclude. It's up to you.
I'll kick things off and I will be brief. In 15 minutes, we have our hearing, another hearing that I sponsored on third-party vendors. So please join us if you can. But Madam Chair, thank you as always for your exceptional partnership and leadership in this space, and to all of my colleagues who participated and really helped elevate it. This is a joint effort. To the Elections Department, again, Commissioner, I know you're relatively new in this role, but not new to leadership in this city. And Sabino, you remain, I shouldn't say this because there are many fellow guests on this, but you remain my favorite podcast guest. And it's one of the highest rated ones when you joined me and we talked about your long history with this city. So thank you both. Cheryl and your team at Mass Vote, you guys have been doing this incredibly important hard work for eons, and we are a far better city because of it. And to every other, Rich, my dear friend from Mission Hill, my former ward chair when I was in Ward 10, Tom, and of course, Ed Cook, who's been a great friend and mentor to me for many, many years, and everybody. Jaya, I don't know you as well, but I'm sure you're terrific as well. So thank you for your work in Fenway. This is obviously incredibly important, incredibly timely, and really, I think, addresses so much of what we need to be focused on as a city as we talk about the post-COVID-19 or perhaps being still in the midst of a COVID-19 world, how we can ensure that we provide safe opportunities for our voters. The election in November is the most consequential election in our lifetime, period. We've often said that before. This time it is the absolute truth. And we want to make sure that folks feel safe, that folks feel supported, and that folks have increased access to voting and to voter participation as it relates to the November election, certainly, but I would argue the September primary as well. We have two big elections coming up. There are some tools in our toolbox that we can use. There are many, many, many more tools at the toolbox that we need state action to occur first before we can employ them. But it sounded to me that there's some real momentum going forward. We have an opportunity to work quickly, work efficiently, work holistically, and at least set the groundwork. So that's why I called for this hearing. We're all rowing, in the same direction, which is really important. We need continued partnership with the state. We need leadership at the state. And then there's a whole myriad of other issues that we need to address as it relates to safety, as it relates to voting location, as it relates to access, as it relates to voter education. So I'm delighted to continue to work in this effort. Thank you to all of you for participating. This was a very, very worthwhile hearing. And I just look forward to continuing to work with each and every one of you. Thank you and be safe.
Thank you very much. Councilor Janey, any concluding remarks?
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I want to say thank you again to the maker for this really important discussion. As I said in the opening, I think this is one of the most important discussions we'll have all year. I am really grateful for the participation of the many advocates in this space, and I won't go through all of them as the maker just did, but I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention Mass Vote as a founding board member and say special thanks to Cheryl and her team for all her work. And certainly many thanks to the administration. Thank you so much, Commissioner Tavares. And thank you, Madam Chair. Looking forward to continuing this conversation along with my colleagues. I think there are some opportunities here that I would like for us to take advantage of, regardless of what happens at the state. And I look forward to seeing this work move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councilor Wu. She may have stepped off. Councilor Campbell. Also, just Councilor Breeden wasn't here last time. So, and Councilor Flaherty of the Councilor Bach.
Yeah, I'll just say, just want to add my thanks to everyone. particular shout out to the Fenway CDC folks who are such warriors in the trenches around, I mean, not just this issue, but, you know, the census and voter registration in general. And I just think we're going to, like I said before, we're going to need all hands on deck for this, no matter what sort of resolutions we reach officially. So just really want to thank you all and thank Mass Vote, which, you know, is amazing and has done this work in and out for many, many years. And thank the commissioner, and looking forward to continuing to partner on the issue. I would just say, count me as a friend and ally and someone who's passionate about, you know, getting people out to vote. So thanks.
Thank you very much. Counselor, he had to go. Counselor Sabi George.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Thank you to the makers. And again, echoing the echoed of thanks to everyone who's here today. It is really nice to see many of your faces and hope that you are all well, and look forward to the lead sponsor and the chair in the working sessions that will be coming up soon, I'm certain. Thank you.
Thank you. Counselor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards. And again, thank you to the administration, to Councilor Edwards, Councilor O'Malley, and to Mass Vote. We worked closely on the 2020 census. That's also critical. One organization that I hear from frequently on this issue is Chinese Progressive Association. So I'll make sure I continue to update them on, and they'll update me as well. But what I want to make sure is that we have a fair and open election. Everyone can participate, especially our seniors, persons with disabilities, our immigrant neighbors, and that they have the access to the ballot, to the application, just like we do. So again, I want to say thank you to the city. I want to say thank you to my colleagues, and most importantly, say thank you to the various organizations that are on this call and that are not on this call, that are doing the great work in our neighborhoods on behalf of those at times without a voice in government. So I want to say thank you.
Thank you very much, Counselor Flynn. With that, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who participated. This is what we're trying to do is define and I guess move democracy in the time of COVID, but also post. And I do think this is a matter of permanency. I don't think this is something we're just going to do temporary. So I do appreciate the amount of work from the elections department. We're talking about how we build a stronger, more inclusive and more accessible election for the city of Boston, if not the entire state. So with that, I'm going to conclude today's hearing on docket 0643. Again, anyone who has additional comments can email them to ccc.go@boston.gov. And we will very likely keep this in working session for continued monitoring of the state's legislation. Thank you all for coming out today.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Bye, everybody. Have a great day. I'll see my colleagues in a few.
Bye all.
Bye.